Minulam, everyone. Minulam, wait, welcome everybody to our TRC 57 speaker series. This is part of our Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools efforts to learn how to walk differently on Coast Salish territory, and I'm glad you could join us. My name's Ted Cadwallader, and I'm joined by our two co-hosts today, Tsawalk from Nuu-chah-nulth Nation and Syeyutsus, Stephanie Johnson. And we're pleased to welcome you all here. As we usually do, following the protocols of this territory, I'm going to turn it to Tsawalk to welcome everybody and set our house in a good way before we begin. So to you, Tsawalk.
Heitska at the Heil 8 square the Tanaquail. The Equami Armastach Aquitha Quam Squallowin. The Equam the Armastach Aquitha 8 Squallowin. The Equam Slachant the Stil Ekith. The Equam Latlamethod Sep at the Saliloch. Tiwiathan Quaswa Kikalis E Kaki Nestimuch. Die Huam Slatakan Stoch Danat Huamach. Tiwiathan Quaswas Slathi Slatakan Zeta Stenathant Tamach. Die Huam Lalamatach to Eli Nashwalaqua Tanaquail. Ether Swatan Shwalaqua Hanamit. Haitga Quans Nan Ut Liat Nemeth. Nawashquam Quamstanasili. Zita CM Haitga Quatstwa Ia Tanatamach a Tanaquail Eta Moxquail Scotland Slay Haitga.
My good friend. Love when Lawrence always sets our house well for what we're about to share. I want to start off our beginning too again in thanking UBC Press. I know that I think Liz is here. So if UBC Press has connected us with many of the authors who joined us in last year's sessions and this year's. So if you are interested in any of the books and any of the authors we talked to, you can visit the TRC 57 speaker series website. And I think there's a discount code there for the books too. So we're pleased, very pleased today to have our initial guest for our second year, Umeek, hereditary chief from Syeyutsus on the west coast of our beautiful island. A long list. I was looking to take the first 20 minutes to read your resume here, Uncle, that's online. But international scholar, researcher, influencer of many of the sectors we work in through education, through Simon Fraser, VIU, Umeek, international universities, speaker, and I think a great giver of knowledge of trying to understand how to live in the world through that Nuu-chah-nulth lens. His book, Principles of Tsawalk, an Indigenous Approach to Global Crisis, just finished last week, and looking through that lens could help us in many of the things we're facing now as individuals, as organizations, as nations. So I will turn the floor over to our great friend, Dr. Richard Atleo.
Thank you. What a privilege it is. I recall one of the first days I entered residential school, and I saw a friend of mine. "Way, what's you?" I said, "Friend, where are you going?" And right away, he put his fingers up to his shh, and he got fear in his eyes. The window went up, and the first words I heard in English were, "You're not allowed to speak your language here." And what a change for any of in the audience who are young, who don't know some of the background to what happened around the world, literally, beginning from 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and many changes took place. The introduction by the prayer song reminds me of when the provincial government allowed a speaker to speak solely in the Nishkat language. And I was in the chambers at that time. This had to do with the land claims issue. And Gosnell spoke. And very unusual in the chambers at that time is that none of the members were talking to each other or making noise or moving around as they usually do during sessions. But instead, they were all transfixed by a language none of them understood. They didn't understand a word. But like the opening we just heard just now, there is an understanding of it that is meaningful. There's a transfer of power that goes into the being at a level that we do not understand. But it's a real transfer, it's a real power. And like that speech that was in the provincial government at that time by Gosnell, Joseph Gosnell, there were some members, politicians, who had tears coming out of their eyes as they listened to words they did not understand. But these words had passion, and they were about a people. They were about a people that had land, and they were about a people that had stories. I will share with you a little bit of that, of which we first heard through this song. We have prayer songs that are in principle similar to the prayer song we just heard, for which I'm thankful and for which I'm appreciative. In the opening of our great potlatches, the first item in our great potlatches was always to acknowledge a vulnerable member of someone that's in attendance. Right now, one of the people in my audience today is a young lady who was one of my first students. Her name is Patricia. I would like to acknowledge Patricia right now in the same way that we used to acknowledge the most vulnerable member that has come to a gathering such as our gathering today. So I acknowledge you, Patricia, in the ancient way. You are a close friend, we would say. You are a close friend. And you are recognized and acknowledged, and you are thanked for coming to this meeting to join us today. In my books, my first two books, these books were meant to provide a glimpse, which is in English meaning you're not going to get the full picture from these books. You will catch a glimpse of a different way of seeing the same world in which we live. We live on a globe today that shares in common some crises in the environment, some crises in human relationships, some crises in governments of corruption around the world in different countries. In the United States and Canada, all over the world, we have instances of a world in which we live that I have like to call polarized, in the sense that it is composed of contradiction and oppositionalities. I'm going to begin now with a summary of some of our stories. The reason I begin with the summary of the stories is that these stories that were judged to be inconsequential and superstitious at the outset of colonization will now be found to be, yes, to have some superstitious elements, but that's not uncommon from other stories, even scientific stories, that also have attached to them elements of superstition. But these stories also are meant to reflect reality, the world as it is perceived by a people who have developed a way of life, a language, rituals, and customs, the whole of which are meant for a people to find a way to live, to find a way to exist. And so we have this first story of Son of Raven. And initially, when anthropologists came across the story, they gave it a title of How Son of Raven Stole the Light. In my experience of storytelling before I learned English, we did not name our stories with titles. So when I examined the story again, I retitled it Quest for the Light, rather than How Son of Raven Stole the Light. Now it's appropriate to title the story How Son of Raven Stole the Light, because apparently that's what he did. But that's taking a particular lens on reality, which is only one part of reality from a Nuu-chah-nulth perspective. So Son of Raven then, in the beginning, found themselves to be in the dark, without light. They knew that across the great waters, the head wolf, he kept the light in a box. In our language, this box has a name. It's called Hupaquanam. And Hupaquanam is interesting today because it's the same container that we might call a container that contains constitutionalism or elements in the box that point to a way of life that is good. And it seemed then to Son of Raven and his community that the light was being withheld on purpose. So they devised a plan to capture the light. Now, several attempts were made which failed. But one that was finally advised by Wren, whose name was A'apwa'ik, one who always speaks rightly, A'apwa'ik being a name that might translate as wise person, A'apwa'ik. And A'apwa'ik's advice was for Wren to turn himself into a tiny, tiny leaf to float in the spring well of the head chief. Because the idea then was when Son of Raven transformed into a tiny, tiny leaf, when the chief's daughter came for a drink, he would maneuver himself into the container, the cup of the daughter of the chief, and so be swallowed. And so this is what he did. And in fact, the story relates how Son of Raven, in today's language, we would say that Son of Raven was born again into the chief's house. He had already been born before, but now he maneuvered himself into the daughter of the chief, and she bore him and birthed him as a baby in the chief's house. Sociopolitically then, this meant that Son of Raven would have hereditary rights to the light because the chief owned the light. Right? But in the story then, eventually, it's a long, long story. And just if I were just to relate this story by itself in the original way, well, we would have to spend hours and hours, right? And we don't have that time today. So Son of Raven successfully then was able to get the light. And when we see Son of Raven today on the beach, like there behind Ted, early in the morning, Son of Raven is found there helping himself to his food that he earned because that's his hahotli, that's his territory, and he has rights to the food on that territory because of this story. So that's the one story. Now, a response to this story by my grandmother, my grandmother Mary, she said, our stories are true. She proclaimed to the whole world, our stories are true. And at the same time, she said, Presbyterians are the greatest Christians in all the world. And to her, there was no contradiction. Our stories are true. Presbyterians are the best Christians in all the world. And for those of you that know something about the history of Christianity, in the early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century, Presbyterians were the preeminent Christians of that time, according to some. In the next story, the story is about how children were stolen by a giant. Again, as an aside, for those of you that know something about the Bible, there were giants in those days in the Bible. So we have a giant in our story. She stole children. She lived in the mountains, and it so happened that one of the children stolen belonged to the chief's wife, and she was overcome with grief when she lost her daughter, who was stolen by a pitch woman. And as she was grieving on the beach, her nose began to run, and she would clean her nose and fling the mucus away. And eventually, she noticed that the mucus that she was flinging away seemed to be guided towards a mussel shell. And the mucus flew into the mussel shell. And eventually what happened is a little baby was born in that mussel shell. And the name of the little baby, very appropriately, came to be son of mucus, because the baby came from, in part, the mucus of the woman. Now, all of these stories, as an aside to outsiders who are not familiar with the nature of these stories, they are all spiritual. They have a spiritual background to them that are essential to the meaning of the stories. So son of raven is born again into the earth through the woman participating with the woman who is grieving. And so the purpose of the birth of son of mucus into the earth was related to pitch woman stealing children from the community. Now, another aside to the story is that children very often are stolen, not by specifically a giant woman, but generally speaking by forces in the world that would subvert the wholeness of family, that would divide and divorce children from the meaning of their parents, that would take children away from the goodness of a strong family life. And we know a lot about that today in our communities. So this story then has meaning in terms of the forces that work against family. So son of mucus then, of course, over time had to grow up in the community. He was a baby and grew up and was obedient to family, learned the language and learned the customs, the hahopa, the teachings of the community. And not until he was a man did son of mucus then finally go into the mountains to rescue the children that had been abducted and killed the woman, brought the children home. And eventually the story will continue thereafter. But before we continue with the story, we want to go to another story. This story is about Bear and a Nuu-chah-nulth fisher. This fisher built a fish trap in a river, local river, and when he went to check the fish trap, he found that it had been broken into. And so he rebuilt the trap, and again, he found it was broken into. So finally, he camped out to see what was going on with his fish trap. And he discovered eventually bear was coming to help himself to the fish caught in the fish trap. So as an aside, I'm going to explain things about the story that's not explained in the story itself, because the people who heard the story didn't need these explanations. But for a modern day audience, in the beginning of time, every being spoke one language. There was no problem with communication, no problem with communication with plants or animals or any being. It's interesting that today our word for Nuu-chah-nulth people is koas, ko-us. Originally, the word did not restrict itself to human beings, because chum salmon are called hin koas. It's exactly the same word. Hin means giving. So chum salmon in the fall, like this time of year, are giving beings. Whoa, trako, 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 haichka, we would say, Coast Salish, haichka to the chum salmon. Why? Because they give of themselves, they give their lives. They give their lives for our well-being, for our strength. They are given beings. Now Darwin didn't know anything about this, so if he had, he might have changed his ideas. A theory that I will get to that at a later time. So, well, what happened in this story is that Nuu-chah-nulth Fisher confronted Bear, and Bear explained why he was taking the salmon. He needed it for his family. And so to prove the point, and this was always necessary in the worldview, is that whatever you say, you have to show, you have to prove what you say. You were not allowed just to have a say and not go follow through with what it is you're saying. So the bear took the fisher to his community, and they had a meeting. Eventually, he had a discussion with the head chief of the community, and they came up with an agreement. I wanted to title my third book, Protocols of Tsawalk, because all of life was to do with the principle of this story, which is where, now, do I kill the bear because he's stealing my salmon, or what am I going to do? So instead, he went through all of this lengthy process of negotiation, traveling a long distance, finding out about the bear. How do the bears live? What do they think? Why do they need salmon? So it turns out that both of them needed salmon to live, and that there was lots and lots and lots of salmon, and there was a way to live with the salmon so that there could be lots of them. There was a way to make the salmon sustainable. There was a way to make the bear sustainable. There's a way to make Nuu-chah-nulth people sustainable. So they came to an agreement that was sustainable. That's the modern language. It's not the language we'd use in the story. There was no need to use words like that because there was not a problem of sustainability in those days. It is a problem today, so we need to use that word. Now, in the final story, this story completes what happened with son of Mucus, Entenmit. Entenmit, after he rescued the children, now he was going to get married. So this story is about marriage, and it's about life. And son of Mucus told the Ahos community, of which he was now a member, that he was going to go home and that he needed their help. He needed their help. One of our teachings is that if you don't ask for help when you need it, you're not being friendly. If you don't ask for help when you need it, you're not being friendly. And to be friendly, aphe, was the highest form of compliment, highest form of character for any being, any Nuu-chah-nulth person. Aphe all playish, right? Very friendly. So son of Mucus was being friendly. He asked for help, and oh, the people, they were so grateful. They made arrows. They made the best arrows, strong arrows, straight arrows. You know, to go the right way, you need strong, straight arrows. And so they made tons of them. And when there was enough, he started shooting the arrows into the sky. He couldn't see where it hit, but eventually they saw the arrows were being shot into each other, making a long line of arrows. You see my head. Finally, the purpose, they realized son of Mucus was going home. And so he climbed up the arrows back home. And so eventually son of Mucus got back to his place. And waiting for him were two women. And they knew he was coming back. And that's part of the unity of existence. We don't have to say that existence is unified. I said it in English, but that's for you guys. In my language, we didn't have to say that. But so they knew he was coming. How did they know? I don't know. Don't ask me. I don't know how they knew, but I know that they knew. Right? And so they had medicine ready for him. And so medicine was part of our way of life, good medicine. And why do you need good medicine? Well, because there's evil medicine. And so you need good medicine. So he got good medicine. The first thing that, now remember, son of Mucus is going to get married. And so he had to go and see the chief. And the doorway to the chief was through a giant codfish mouth. If you've ever seen a codfish mouth, you don't want to go there. You don't want to go there. He's got a very bad mouth, right? And so he had to go through that mouth, and right away the codfish clapped down. And son of Mucus, being Mucus, eventually turned himself into Mucus and slid out safely, harmlessly, inside the chief's house. The next thing was that son of Mucus had to help the chief split a giant cedar log, right? And the intent of this by the chief was to see if all of these were tests to son of Mucus. Is he worthy to marry the daughter? You know, is he worthy to marry the daughter? That was a principle of marriage, is that the man had to prove himself. Man had to prove himself, right? He's courageous, he's strong, he's one you can depend upon. He's got everything it takes, right? And so the chief split the giant cedar log and dropped in the wedge in there and said, go and get the wedge. So he went inside to get the wedge, and the chief took out the main separating wedge, and the giant cedar log closed on son of Raven, who turned himself into Mucus and came out harmlessly. So eventually there was another test, which I'm not going to go through. He was successful also in the other test, which had to do with fire. So eventually, son of Mucus was proven worthy to marry the chief's daughter. And so he got married. And so the story about marriage is about how to live. That how to live is dangerous. How to live means overcoming danger. How to live means proving yourself to be courageous. How to live means even when there's deception, even when there's lies involved, you overcome the deception. You overcome the lies with being straight. You stay son of Mucus. If you're Mucus, don't change. Stay Mucus. It's going to help you in the long run. Don't try to be something else. We know in other stories, we call the trickster, that he was always trying to be something else, right? And he never succeeded. So in these stories, we are taught that when you try to be somebody else, you're setting yourself up for failure. You're setting yourself up for humiliation. You're setting yourself up for what we call making a fool of yourself. Wakumsa, we would say. Wakumsa is making a fool of himself, herself, by going the wrong way. So these brief comments of these stories then. I want to situate these stories to my own personal situation. I was born in 1939, just at the beginning of the Second World War. And out on the West Coast, we were very isolated. We didn't have roads, we didn't have running water, we had no electricity, no telephones. We still had wells. Do we have wells anywhere today? I don't know. We don't have any more wells. But we had lots of wells. Now, isn't that amazing? We live on an island, and there are thousands of islands in the world, and they have fresh water. Can you explain that? I can't. I can't explain it. Actually, I can, but I'm not going to. But we had no wells. And when I was born, I never heard the English language. It was very, very rare. We had a missionary at the end of the 19th century that had arrived, but there were very few people, white people, on the coast at that time. And those that came, they actually fit in with us. They actually obeyed our laws. For example, if they found something drifting, they understood that all the territory was owned by chiefs, and that everything that was in the territory owned by the chief belonged to the chief. And so you would bring it to the chief, who, when you brought it, would give you some kind of payment for it. So the white people, they obeyed our laws in these early days. And so I was born at a time when we were unmolested, really. Very infrequently, we had a visit from Indian agent once a month or something. There was a steamboat that came by infrequently, but we were left to ourselves. We still had our own ceremonies. I witnessed a traditional Klukwana, which was outlawed at that time, according to Canada's legal system. But because we're so isolated, all we had to do was post guards outside our big house in case a missionary was snooping around and to give us warning. And this explains, by the way, why we have curtains today. That we initially had cedar boards to separate dancers from the audience. But when our ways were outlawed, we developed curtains, because if missionaries came around or somebody, we could put them away very quickly and say, what? No, nothing happening here. You know? So I was born at a time that I was unaware that of major changes that were taking place in the world, had already taken place in many parts of Canada. But I didn't know that at the time. So I want to shift now to, oh my, I'm running out of time. I want to shift to a comparison. I'm a qualified academic researcher. I have a doctorate degree. I studied the hard sciences, if you will. In a scientific world, generally speaking, there are what you call the hard sciences and the soft sciences. And I took on the hardest. And I did it on purpose because I believe that, that the peoples were not superior as peoples to our people. We're not superior. So I wanted the most difficult of their ways. I wanted to tackle that, to prove that we are equally capable. Also, when I went into my doctoral program, I asked around, I said, who is the most difficult professor? I want that professor. And they told me who he was. And sure enough, boy, was he tough. He was really tough, let me tell you. But I'm not allowed to, in my culture, talk about myself. But in this case, there's nobody to talk for me. So I'm forced to do something that's against my culture. But I met the man, and we squared off, and it was a draw. So there are two main stories, if you will. I talked about the stories from my culture. Within science, there is, in the hard sciences, there is what we might classify as the reductionist view created by Charles Darwin in his theory of evolution. The main part of that theory had to do with the outcome that impacts economies and political platforms today. And his study of plants showed that certain plants could replace other plants. This was then translated into societies that could replace other societies. So that's why during colonization, it was believed that indigenous societies would be replaced. They would disappear. So that's why we have anthropology. That's why we have museums, because museums were developed to save the relics of indigeneity. What is left over from a dying race we'll put into museums. So we'll have some record of them. And so this is based on a Darwinian view, and it's supported by research. It's supported by hard science, that this is actually what happens out there in nature, that this does happen. Colonization did happen. It's a fact. It's recorded, unfortunately for us. But there's another view. Thank you. There's another view within the hard sciences. Within the same scientific lens, we have another view of the same reality. Janine, I want you to read the names. Janine Benyus, May Won Ho, Lynn Margulis, and Elizabeth Sartuas. These are scientists and the hard scientists who have proven through their research, through their studies, that in fact, reality also is cooperative. Reality also supports cooperation, and they've proven it through the hard scientists. Now, these two views of reality are identical to the Nuu-chah-nulth view, in that they both show up and down. They both show good and evil. They both show ruthlessness and helpfulness. They both show the opposite, oppositionalities, as I call them, of reality, the contradictions of reality. It's there today. If you look, you will see it everywhere today. I like to talk about Volkswagens. Before we bought our first Volkswagen, never saw them at all. We bought our first Volkswagen, all of a sudden, Volkswagens everywhere. Wow. I never saw so many Volkswagens. But before we bought one, I didn't see them. That's a lens. It's a lens. It's a story about a human lens, what we look at, what we pay attention to. What did the ancient Nuu-chah-nulth pay attention to? They saw reality. They saw all of it. Right? They saw the good and evil. As a matter of fact, we had a teaching in my house Kalk oil, peat on the floor. Oil, a symbol of power, symbol of wealth. It's a symbol of wealth and power today. But in our symbols, they were spiritual powers, real powers. There was this teaching that there are two kinds of spirits. One gives good advice, the other gives bad advice. They're the very opposite. Listen to the good advice. They knew about the bad advice, but they said, listen to the good advice. Live by the good advice. You make a choice. You choose today how you're going to live. The other is there. It's there. If you don't pay attention to it, if you don't do something to manage it, you're going to become a victim of it, as we have. So, in sort of I have to move towards the conclusion here because we're running out of time. Some of the salient points, main points, highlights of the presentation has to do with, amazingly, the similarity of what is at the heart of the meaning of the way people see the world through their own practices, language, foods, housing, clothing, everything that they used to make a living with, that they were happy with. I noted that in the beginning, when Gilbert Sprout came to the West Coast, and he told Chief Syeyutsus, a Nuu-chah-nulth chief, he said, we English were going to give you jobs, because you don't work your land. And he didn't see them working the land. They did work the land, but in a different way than the English did. We didn't make fences around plants in the way the English did, but it doesn't mean we didn't grow plants. We grew plants, right? We tended them. And so Chief Syeyutsus said, we don't want your jobs. Go back home. We don't want you here. No, we're happy with the way we live. I want to side with Chief Syeyutsus and say, yeah, I prefer that way of life than to the English jobs that were offered at that time. By the way, the jobs did not materialize for a long time. So much for the promises. Okay, sorry about that. I don't mean to be bad or mean. So the view of reality as perceived by ancient peoples were meant for living. They acknowledged the enigmaticness of reality. When you have an enigma, it means that you have something that's confusing, contradictory, something that is you can't untie. It seems to be tied up in knots. And so this is a very common problem. If you look around the world, all the world have been faced with the same kind of problem. And what is amazing to me is that ancient peoples like Nuu-chah-nulth, they managed this problem very well. In an emergent fashion, if you know what emergent means, it means in the beginning of. To me, they did a wonderful and excellent job. And it's like the beginning of good science. They made lots of mistakes. There were lots of errors. There were lots of roads that went astray. But the main focus, their main strength was going the right way. And to me, the reason that Nuu-chah-nulth peoples and others have survived is based not on what others have done for us, but based on the strength of our own ancestry, based on the strength of our own language, strength of our own spirit, the strength of that something that cannot be articulated in language, but can be proven by the fruit that it produces. And the fruit that it produces is people who still hang on to family, still hang on to things they believe are true, even if they can't prove it while they're in it, but they are still there. And they are the people who help when no one else is helping. They are the people who forgive those who have done them wrong and go along and try to be helpful, even against the current that is like that. And it's not different from the original days. It's not different from the original days. It is the same, the same. The same strength of character is required. The same strength of spirit is required. And this indefinable thing is what is required in the school system, in the Cowichan School District, in the university programming, in kindergarten. It's required when a woman is pregnant, you begin the teaching there. And you can do it now. You can do it in the way our ancestors did. And it's not just an indigenous thing. On the scientific panel, the scientists came to me on the scientific panel after they had rejected everything we said. They eventually accepted everything we said, and they said to me, "We too were once Aboriginal." Yeah. I said, "Yeah, you were once Aboriginal too. My whole audience, you were all once Aboriginal. You were all once a people of strength. Be strong together today. Be strong together today. Not in destroying, but in helping, in being a good person. It's possible. Ancient people prove it. It can be done. They proved it. They are a living example. Chu aha'una wa aknish. Aha'una is a formal phrase that an orator in our great feasts, after telling the story, he would say, Chu aha'una. Chu means bow. You bow. It's a sign of respect, bowing. Aha'una is that it is that long, is what it means. But in today's language, we would say that's the end of the story. It marks the limitation of our knowledge. It marks the limitation of what we know. And what we know is not just head knowledge. What we know is what we have experienced. It's down in our heart, not just in our heads. Aha'una, that is as far as it goes. It's not that much, even though it is a great amount. But still, when we think of Kwa'uts, it's not that much. It's not that much, so we bow. Chu, tlaka, tlaka.
Gelakasla, Haichka, Uncle. When I was reading your book, I was looking at those creation stories, and some I'm familiar with from where I'm from and from where I'm here in Hul'kameetnamkun territory as well. And there's so much embedded in those stories about how to be a good human on this territory. I loved your stories about Son of Mucus, and how to be in the world, how to be resilient in the face of good and evil, of struggle and resilience. And our Bachwam, our Homach relatives demonstrate that every single day. Our children who are coming to the school demonstrate that resilience. There's also a feeling in our school districts that we could be different on these territories. And those stories help us on our quest to be different. So I'm going to raise my hands in thanks for the knowledge that you shared with us today of those Nuu-chah-nulth teachings. And I'm going to turn it over to our relative Lawrence to close our house in a good way.
Like when it's stuck, CM Dr. Richard Atleo, a ton of quail. I just got slacket to eight snoweth. I quam stuck ton squall ones at the elite nishwalakwa. I just got CM truly touched in a really good place by hearing everything that you had to share with us. And it's like nourishing for my spirit. And it makes me feel really good inside to hear some of the ancient ways shared. And I'm touched in a good place. And I feel really good about our gathering here today. And I can speak for all of us when I say I look forward to seeing you again and sharing some sacred time with you. It's truly a privilege and it's an honor to be a part of this. And I thank everybody in attendance. Haitga. Syeyutsus at the thema CIs at an aquail. The hum la limit that sep at the Eli Nishwalaqua, Emish the Hanamet at an aquail. The hum la limit that sep at the Saleloch, eat a litzit, eat smanam. Haichka quatstwa e at an atamach at an aquail, eat a muxquail. Haichka Syeyutsus now wash quam quum stanasali. Haichka.